Mama, I love you. My week starts out with an interaction that, for a moment, fulfills all my needs. She gives me a firm hug, holds on longer than I expected. She smiles. Her unique facial expression fills my existence with an abundance of meaning. I guess this is awe. Even though I am tired and would adore some alone time, we means the world to me. While her tendency to set and unset boundaries is intensified, so is her expression of attachment and love. As parents, we practice presence and patience. As a child, she practices being her own body within the social body we call family. No, she tells us convincingly. If needed, she is a rock. Most of the time we do not speak in rocky words, we speak in movements, fluid or somewhat solid facial expressions, and a magical ongoing creative evolution we embody as an abundance of sensations. Sometimes I feel so fragile, all those developmental leaps. What will her future be like? Wildfires, heat waves, crop failures, and floods. At night, I sometimes wake up with a frightening image in my mind. She tumbles down the stairs and nearly drowns in the horrifying deep sea that has replaced our living room. Is this progression? I feel anger because of our species, because of my own apparent inability to do something about the unfolding ecological crisis. Luckily, I often rest in her here and now. We draw meditatively. We dance to her favorite music. Mama, the girl with the violin. She shares her exhilarant enthusiasm when she sees a fly. She is the fly, always on the fly. Sometimes I feel ashamed just looking into her eyes. Sometimes I do not dare to hold her gaze for more than a moment. I know that her love for her parents is intensely intertwined with the trust that we somehow secure her future, that we guide her every time she walks down the stairs. The uncontrollable passing of time is only truly understood through a feeling experience of the world. The experience of taking another step, letting the forces of nature, letting gravity do its work. In this phenomenological dimension of life, her subjective experience is tightly connected to our proximity and responsible caretaking. We will catch her if she falls too fast. Parenthood is also a force of nature. Still, her time-traveling mind is growing in strength and organization every day. One day, I know, she will be able to time travel way beyond the here and now, way beyond the physical existence of her parents. I am afraid this day will come too soon and will be too frightening. We, as a species, need to act, so that children will have the safe space to time travel far, far into the future. Can I ethically and practically catch up with her daydreaming abilities? I must trust. Her leg muscles are becoming stronger day by day. This is her way of bending the arrow of time. Hello everybody! Thank you in advance for watching this video. I hope you have been enjoying the conference so far, and that our current creative and academic dialogue with Dabrowski's perspectives have been both a personal and professional invitation to keep on growing and exploring on-site. In this video, I also invite you to walk along with me on a path that I'm just beginning to forge. My video is both a heartfelt and playful artistic exploration of a developmental process I'm undergoing for quite some time now. Sharing this video is also an attempt to grow a relevant network that supports both the self and other-oriented transformations that are part of the creative project that is growing out of my developmental process. First things first, my name is Lotte van Lith. Mother of a sensitive and strong-willed 2-year-old. Partner of an equally strong-willed partner. I have been working with Dabrowski's theory for more than, let's say, 10 years now, and Dabrowski's writings have been a dear companion in understanding many layers and levels of emotional development. A dear companion in, I dare to say, learning how to recognize and appreciate emotional wisdom as a guiding source of inspiration, direction, and comfort. Seeing inner conflicts as part of our emotional learning process has been one of the most supportive and healing perspectives I have encountered. Not to mention all the subtle, emotional, and cognitive complexities Dabrowski's writings mirror back to us as part of an all-encompassing artistic, humanistic, and ideally also altruistic developmental journey. I've studied, amongst others, Italian language and culture, complexity studies and literary studies, and self-educationally wise, disciplines such as psychology and philosophy, and the continuous practice of life as a deeply relational dynamic process are nourishing sources of intellectual, creative, emotional, and spiritual growth. In day-to-day life, I work as a life coach for gifted adolescents and adults, as well as a lecturer. I organize vivid seminars and trainings on topics such as creative giftedness and emotional development, and write about related topics such as intensity of emotions and sense-making processes. Let me tell you a bit more about the creative project that is the impetus for this video. Undoubtedly, we live in a time of global existential threat. Like many, and for a long time, I have ignored the facts and painful awareness of what is going on. For more than a year now, I consciously choose to disintegrate my conditioned response to ignore global, social, and environmental problems, and the complexity and intensity of suffering related to these problems. Better yet, I choose to disintegrate my response to ignore my own anxiety, the undercurrent of uncertainty, and the broader palette of emotional responses reflecting change. As a form of self-education and organized disintegration, I have been learning a lot about climate change and the interconnected aspects, such as social inequalities and human relationship with and place in nature. The existential internal conflicts that accompany this process have been intense and challenging. I will reflect on this a bit further on, but amongst others, feelings of inferiority and mourning have been part of the journey. In meditative moments, I'm finding the space to process these feelings and emotions. And by connecting with people who are inspiring because of their activism for conscious action, well-being, and exploration of new ways to understand ourselves, I intrinsically feel and felt more and more encouraged to connect my emotional and intellectual learning process with a creative outlet that is valuable to others. A creative project that would also provide context for the existential development of a more clear, ethically and practically guiding hierarchy of values adapted to our times. In this presentation, I will reflect upon certain aspects of the intimate, emotional, and self-educational process, and some of the relevant activated dynamisms. Practically and emotionally, I'm not yet fully living the mentioned hierarchy of values, so these reflections I share are part of a currently still vulnerable process. Let me share the overall aim, the current status and structure of the creative project. In this project, I combine self-development with the creation of a book, a podcast series and training modules. The running theme in the book is my personal developmental journey and the self-reflections that accompany this process. In this journey, I wish to integrate ecological intelligence in my way of living, understanding, relating, and acting. The positive disintegration theory serves as a major source of inspiration and as a main conceptual framework to structure this existential development from an emotional and cognitive perspective. I will weave in other theoretical threads using insights from, amongst others, integral psychology, eco-psychology, moral and spiritual development. In the podcast series, I intend to interview exemplars of morality, and these interviews will serve as inputs for portraits in the book. Exemplars of morality are persons that, through their actions, express their hierarchy of values. They actively contribute to ecological and social wisdom, reducing suffering and increasing well-being. They can be activists, politicians, authors, artists, space holders such as trainers and teachers. Ideally, the podcast series also offers space for more marginalized voices to be heard and known. In the portraits, I strive to describe a continuous dialogue between representing the development and personality of the interviewees and my intimate responses to the interactions with these exemplars of morality. The emotional, intense process of engaging with someone who is deeply inspiring to me is a fundamental part of this type of creative writing. This way, creating those portraits is a way of journaling, of meditating on and of identification with higher realities, of actively facilitating my personal development and creating a text that is both insightful and heartfelt, both analytically and symbolically rich. Furthermore, the creation of the book, the personal developmental journey and the podcast will also serve as input, inspiration and an invitation to the participants of a training module dedicated to transformational giftedness, as Bergh calls it. In this module, participants will be challenged to understand their personal and professional development as embedded in the wider global context, to do research into the question how to facilitate their own and others' potential transformational giftedness, and form a supportive community in which they guide each other in integrating insights into their everyday choices, the way they work with giftedness and gifted people, and their guiding value system. One idea is that the participants will be invited to interact co-creatively with the content of the podcast. This might lead to self-reflections that partially will be integrated in the book, in the form of transcripts, for example. Should participants decide to express their experiences and process in a different form, let's say poetry, dance or music, this will certainly also be welcomed. The precise work forms for the training and the participants' contributions to the book is something that can be further explored. As this creative project is an open-ended process, this video is also very much an invitation to others, for others to share their ideas, their relevant examples, and their network, if they will. In this project, I intend to share my findings frequently on social media, and I hope the video contributes to a vivid dialogue about the related topics. I am sure there are many others experiencing a similar disintegrative process within the more global existential crisis. That said, climate change is a global challenge, but every person's growing awareness is highly contextualized. And this immediately makes me feel uneasy, as the direct consequences of climate change are not felt by me as strongly as by others right now. Not only have I been ignorant based upon my conditioning and lack of knowledge, I also have had the privilege to not have noticed the effects directly. This uneasiness is also part of the developmental process. The uneasiness invites me to understand the complexity of our global ecosystem and synthesizes me to consider the suffering and well-being of others, seriously impacted by our everyday choices and the power structures also facilitating my wealth. Humbleness is certainly also a virtue this process summons me to practice. So, if you're interested to contribute to my project, as well as to voice your particular experience of a global problem, maybe you know a person that could be interesting to interview, please feel free to contact me and we can see if there's a match. For now, I want to share some personal, intimate reflections on the process behind the development of this creative project. My conditioned response to ignore global suffering goes back to the childhood memory of watching the television, being confronted with images of the Gulf War, and not being able to talk about it. We turned off the television and started eating our evening dinner. The simultaneous reality of processing the horrific facts of war and the food in my mouth was emotionally and physiologically too much for me. And thus I decided not to digest those news messages ever again. I think, as a child, I already did not see why their suffering is fundamentally different from our suffering. And I felt that our everyday dissociation from other people's suffering was one of the major causes for incessant suffering. At the same time, I did not inhabit a position of power in which I could directly make a difference for the collective. I did not embody the cognitive complexity to understand the complexity of human interaction. And I did not understand how to live the preliminary wisdom practically. My conditioned response, partially due to an unknowingness and the lack of social safety in the environment, was to also dissociate from these feelings. Looking back, an important aspect of this response was related to something I still experience now and then. The sheer disbelief in human tendency to harm each other in the most grueling manner. Perhaps a more accurate understanding is that I was not yet able to integrate the emotions triggered by the images. Something that was of course dependent upon my age and my environment. The freeze response was activated every time I encountered information about intense suffering. In educational contexts, this response was aggravated, since there was an emphasis on learning. In other words, the emphasis lay on being open towards new experiences, while there also was a serious lack of secure reflections on the emotions triggered by the content we studied. Every time somebody would bring up the topic of war or other intense suffering, I felt empty, disillusioned, depressed, and powerless. Years later, when I met my current partner, I was struck by his outward expression of emotions about injustices. He would be clearly angry and intensely disturbed when talking about power structures and suffering like warfare. When reflecting on his development, he clearly remembered the impact watching the movie Schindler's List had on him as a young adolescent. He experienced shock, but even more so a raw existential image of human beings. This is what we are. I felt attracted to his intensity, recognized it in a certain way, but at first hardly showed my emotions in such a direct, to me sometimes also disturbing way. During our relationship, we have come to learn from each other. This could be a whole video in and of itself. But the main development that I can share in this context is that he dared me to also take a stance. It was also his intellectual and psychomotor overexcitabilities that questioned the power of my hesitative approach. We had a tough time facilitating each other in integrating the emotions and feelings that come along with our natural tendency to discuss serious topics. As our relationship grew further, we ignored certain conflicts and therefore experienced partial emotional development. Our learned patterns were challenged when our daughter was born. And even before that, within me, in the fine-grained process of physically becoming a mother. Raising our wonderful, sensitive girl, my partner and I must work together and cannot deny certain dynamics anymore. Next to the changes in our relational context and dynamic, the fact that we became parents also connected our actions here and now to future generations. Every cell in my body knew, also thanks to what some might call anticipatory grief, that I needed to confront certain emotional patterns. My tendency to flee facts that include intense suffering would no longer be wise enough to live with the complexity of being both a responsible human being and a conscious, loving mother. In short, as a family, we experience our interdependency more strongly. Motherhood had created the perfect context for a new existential conflict. I could perceive a lower and a higher reality. The lower reality would be to ignore the by now so intensely experienced fact that our context matters, and that the truer reality of our existence lies in the interdependency that we are, which brought upon the necessity to wake up to the realities of climate change. Before, my partner and I lived more as connected individuals than as human beings, integrally part of a bigger ecosystem. Now, with our third partner on board, I knew this was a false perception of reality based on personal traumas and restrictive cultural narratives. The higher reality I perceived was the fact that we are indeed a part of a much bigger whole, and that our feelings of loneliness, seriously tested by being permanently ready to take care of our child, created a false perception of separateness. By necessarily tapping into this higher level reality, something that was wired into my day-to-day life by being continuously responsible for the well-being of our daughter and recognizing the plasticity with which she learns and is clearly fully dependent on her environment, I felt compelled to decondition my response to global suffering. I could not rely anymore on a narrative in which, on a more global scale, separateness and short-term gain over long-term well-being was still the leading theme. The intensely embodied experience of being a mother had made me remember that I also was an integral part of nature. Remembering this brought along feelings of sorrow over a long-lost connection, feelings of inferiority towards the person that I was, based on my convictions, anger at our species' seeming inability to do something about this unfolding crisis, and shame about my apparent inability to perceive nature and human beings in a much more organic and interconnected manner. I tapped into my affective memory and saw the child that I once was. A sensitive girl that was even hesitant to take another step while being conscious of the fact that with every step I might also crush insects. This girl, I thought, needed to rewild herself, needed to deeply feel that she was part of nature, including nature's borderless interconnectedness. including death as a crucial phase in the cycle of life. I needed to upgrade my biological knowledge, ability to perceive nature in her diversity and complexity, and to face fears that make me focus on uni-level self-preservation instead of multi-level responsibility. As a result, dynamisms such as self-education came into play. I started to read a lot about biology, about climate change, about non-human agency, and about divergent ways of looking at who we are as human beings and how we understand ourselves. I dared to watch media coverages of the wildfires, heat waves, crop failures, and floods, and to see the reality of the climate crisis unfold in front of our eyes, in other people's and animals' dear habitats. I started to confront my own tendency to mirror other people's automatisms, to ignore these facts, and to over-focus on certain human problems. Self-education also stimulated a more profound form of empathy, since it gave me a certain insight and intuitive understanding and perception of other sentient beings. For example, by diving into the work of Peter Wolleben, who you might know from his book The Hidden Life of Trees, I started to actually see individual trees, their particular needs and talents, and their place within a bigger whole in a much more direct manner. I felt invited to acknowledge these trees as an equally vital part of our shared ecosystem. Saw more clearly that they had their own natural logic and powerful ways to adapt and grow. I saw their personality, if you will, and their often also highly social lifestyle. From a variety of viewpoints, I recognized the many connections with nature we live, that we are. I dared to anthropomorphize, while at the same time learned to be more humble towards the specificity of other beings. At times, this also came along with the experience of alienation. Dabrowski might call this positive alienation. There were both extra layers in myself between the previous selves and the currently developing one, but also between my social surroundings, our Western culture, and the imagined, needed culture. Not coincidentally, also in this context, I remembered my feelings of family, social, and emotional loneliness. And by now could see that one part of the sensitive answer to these feelings lies in a reconnection with nature. Then and now, I also encourage myself to follow different training programs in embodied intelligence, thereby intensifying insight into relational dynamics, subtle and true expressions of emotions, needs, and values. Hereby, I recognize higher levels of reality in the external milieu, gravitating towards those people who I feel are very authentic, honest, and have showed a depth of development with which I can identify. This ongoing program of development even, turns out to be an invaluable source of orthopsychotherapy, partially based on the development of the dynamism subject-object. By practicing embodiment, I come to perceive a much more nuanced and layered process of awareness, in which I tend to identify with thought, but once I create more mental and emotional space, I can choose either to stay present with authentic feelings or engage with mind in a creative manner. Also, I am learning to do nuanced research into the question whether fragments of the content of my consciousness are also something that I really want to express outwardly. Thanks to the guidance of thoughtful and present others, I am learning to both embody the energy of instincts and feelings and look at the contents of my mind as if it were objects, to study those contents more precisely. This learning process is unbelievably valuable. Seeing overexcitable me tends to verbalize fast and, at times, impulsively. By creating additional mental space to stay with the process while not dissociating from feelings, nor getting over-involved in certain objects of the mind, I also facilitate the inner space for a fundamental revision in my attitudes towards certain cultural, social, and psychological structures. And, last but certainly not least, my partner and I learn how to co-create our relational dance differently, entering a higher reality in which we are both deeply autonomous and fundamentally interconnected. Throughout this process, and based on what I have been learning through self-education, I have noticed that I'm having doubts with respect to some aspects of Dabrowski's perspectives. These do not seem to connect with my current learning process. For example, under a pseudonym, Dabrowski writes, "The authentic in a man is not the animal, but the man." Perhaps this expression is best understood in the times when Dabrowski lived. The cruelty of 2 world wars made many understandably describe this as inhuman, as animalistic. I think, as a humanist, Dabrowski also reacted to, interacted with man's disturbing consciousness of what violence human beings were capable of, and what self-image would bring out the better in human. Although I do see that certain, if you will, lower instincts of human are strongly related to our animalistic brain structures, I think it is all the more important that we, especially psychoneurotics, do not inhibit these experiences too quickly or strongly. That we learn how to stay present with these intensities, embody them consciously, and ultimately express them in a compassionate manner. I would have loved to discuss Dabrowski's views on this matter with the man himself, because it could be that I'm upholding a narrative here that does not mirror the nuances of his multi-level approach and his layered understanding of authenticity. I do think that one vital part of our current challenge is to rewild ourselves and recognize deeply that we are indeed a human animal. The higher reality is also a deeper reality, quite literally. In this sense, I think we should not undermine the role the sensual and psychomotor aspects of our body beingness have in our psychological makeup, developmental process, and ways of being in the world, in this body. And even more so, that cultural tendencies to dismiss the expression of these dimensions of ourselves as a sin contribute to forms of disintegration that may not be that necessary to set forth, that may not always be developmentally valuable in the first place. In a multi-level sense, the challenge lies in the integration between emotion and cognition, something Dabrowski probably would have emphasized. I think it is important to first acknowledge instincts and emotions without judgment, because otherwise their intense content is not understood from an embodied perspective. In any case, this appears to be an important aspect of my own learning process. Yet another dynamism was triggered by this process. the creative instinct. Creativity was always an important channel for my intimate growth processes. It was one of the ways to facilitate the emotional development I always felt was so important, based on a value system partially grounded in the process of healing emotional trauma. A sense of competence, even more so feelings of astonishment, have grown out of the publication of my first book, titled Intense Mens. And, as a trainer, I'm used to invent many new work forms, combine concepts and perspectives, and to create conflicts as to facilitate growth. Even though this creativity already was for a great deal intertwined with the mentioned, partially developed value system, it is true that my creativity up till now lacked the integration of a reality function embedded in a more global scale. To me, it already was particularly important whether what I created was of any developmental value to others, and also implied the exploration of a higher level reality. Nonetheless, whilst creating, I ignored certain unpleasant facts due to a conditioned response to suffering. This ignorance was and is mirrored by a lack of cohesion between a developed hierarchy of values and a hierarchy of concrete, practicized goals, resulting in periods and moments of multi-level expressions of creativity in which the tragedy and comedy of human life is expressed, and in periods of increased ambivalences, feelings of shame and guilt related to the discongruency between my deeply felt reflections and day-to-day uni-level tendencies. So, in Dabrowski's terms, one might say that in this new process, a higher level integration between the creative instinct and the self-perfection instinct was catalyzed. It became increasingly clear to me that the challenge we face as human beings is something that I could only face head-on once I connected all different dimensions of my life in a multi-level manner. One might even say, once I developed into an authentic personality, in the Dabrowski sense. This holistic approach is also important as an alternative to the partial uni-level perfectionism that was part of previous periods of my life, such as the time in which I struggled with eating disorders, and my leading ideal was rooted in unhealthy societal standards. My way of coping with severe loneliness in my family situation. From within, I noticed that I needed some sort of integrative power in my life to connect creativity with healthy ideals, an activity in which diverse needs, characteristics, and challenges are interconnected and create the flow and synergy needed for personality development. One might say that this insight was connected to the development of the third factor and the directing and disposing center. The development of these autonomous dynamisms was contrasted by a painful awareness of my neurotic ambivalences and a by now recognized denial of certain aspects of my gifted profile. I needed and need to lean into a dynamism called positive maladjustment, because the realization of this project demands to let go of a tendency to hold on to certain securities and the instinct of self-preservation on a low level, such as a rigid focus on my financial income, partially rooted in the same restrictive cultural and societal narratives that I mentioned encountering within myself and my dearest relationships. From personal experience, I can understand why Dabrowski might have emphasized the importance of the dynamism positive maladjustment. Because in practice, and perhaps for an emotionally overexcitable person in particular, it is quite challenging to let go of the learned ways of living and interacting, and to choose to consciously try out alternatives that dismiss automatisms of your tribe, but may indeed be aligned with your developing value system. My own challenge, for example, lies also in suggestibility and the dynamism of ambivalence that pops up easily. Although I appreciate my openness towards other people, there is also vulnerability, partially rooted in childhood trauma, because I may become more of a mirror of other people's tendencies than a personality of my own. Positive maladjustment, I feel, is also an exercise in true feelings of responsibility, rising from authenticity. A tendency to avoid risks and sacrifice, to negatively adjust to a certain dominant cultural script, undermines one's options to experiment empathically with diverse lifestyles. And more importantly, to consciously choose based upon personal lived-through hierarchy of values. Nonetheless, initial contours of dynamisms such as the feeling of responsibility and the capacity for profound but also active empathy were becoming more sensible, and I felt a strong pull towards a new way of living. One of the qualities or even virtues that I knew I needed to support me on this journey was patience. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, because based on the state of our ecosystem, we really do not have much time. Even though this is clearly the case, I deeply feel that being able to slow down our pace is part of the solution, on the level of consciousness, if you will. On the level of integrating an embodied understanding of what it means to be a human animal, part of nature, and to live a different kind of life, in which different values and a thorough understanding of everybody's fundamental needs are a source of guidance and inspiration. On a personal level, by learning to become patient, I train my ability to stay present with the higher and deeper levels of reality inside of me. With the creative project that is growing out of the developmental process I just shared with you, I give myself time and space to research into what is my hierarchy of values and how this directly translates into a hierarchy of goals, an ethical, practical way of living. The form and structure of this research hopefully helps me to fulfill diverse needs and stay in contact with the guiding spirit, with the emotional undercurrents and truth that is, this time, not ignored but openly explored. More importantly, by slowing down and not living in a rat race, I give myself the emotional, social, intellectual and creative space to learn how to be honest, how to face the facts, to not ignore suffering, to stay present with the intensity of the complexity of being alive. Of being alive during our existential crisis. Staying present with the experience of being alive to me is very much also about giving myself the potential to rewild. Staying present is not easy. It confronts us with pain. It confronts us with unmet longings, with uncertainty, with our own sensitivities and the inherent losses of life. At the same time, it connects us with improvisation, with wisdom, with our context and our subtle interactions. It is an invitation to experience being a part of the web of life, a network of interactions, vibrant and often also disorienting. Hopefully, This fluid program of development will also facilitate the well-being and development of others. We'll inspire them to explore their nature in the broadest sense of the term, and to invite our inner dimension to be an equally vital part of our wisdom. For now, I would be happy to hear from you. Do you recognize these processes? Do you have ideas whom to interview? Or what kind of work forms are inspirational to participants of the module about transformational giftedness? Please contact me at lotte@alotofcomplexity.com. Lotte@alotofcomplexity.com. Thank you for your patience, attention and time. And I wish you all the best.